All right, so welcome to today's video. We're going to talk about price discrimination. Price discrimination is discussed in chapter 24 of the book, but we're going to go into much greater depth today in today's lecture. So the book is helpful as an introduction, but make sure you're taking really good notes on today's lesson. Okay, so first of all, let's go back to the type of example we've been dealing with in the past. This is a monopoly that faces this conundrum of sorts. If it wants to raise the price, it will be forced to lose quantity. So even though a monopoly is a price searcher, even though they can select the price they want to choose, they can't just charge any old price. They can't just charge, $1 million because they will be left with no consumers. So they still have to think about demand when making their choices. So for this monopoly, if they choose prices the way we've done in the past, as they lower the price, they'll be able to raise their quantity. All right, and this is all review. This is all stuff that you saw from the last video. Okay, so as the price goes down, they're able to produce more to sell to consumers. And the marginal revenues, which is the change in revenues divided by the change in price, would look like this. Okay, so this monopoly would face a scenario where the demand curve and the marginal revenue are not the same. The demand curve is shown by price and quantity. This shows willingness to pay here. Okay, so this is willingness to pay. Okay, that's willingness to pay. Total revenue shows how much they earn, and you can see that the marginal revenue curve does not line up with the demand curve. In fact, the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as demand. So for this monopoly, there would be some sort of corresponding marginal cost curve. We'd find quantity at marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and we'd find price by determining what is the willingness to pay for this firm if they are producing the optimum quantity. Okay, so that's all the type of graph that we saw from last class, right? This is nothing new to us. What we're going to introduce today is the concept of price discrimination. Okay, so I'm going to erase most of this. I'm going to leave these numbers up here because we're going to continue to work with them. So what we're going to talk about now is price discrimination. Price discrimination is a common thing. It's something that you deal with in normal times on a day-to-day basis. Price discrimination occurs when firms figure out a way to charge different customers different prices. All right, and the reason I wanted to really talk about this a lot is because I think it's a really important microeconomic principle. And I'm kind of surprised the book didn't go more in depth on this issue. If you think about your consumption, rarely do you face the same price at even the same moment when you're buying items. So for example, if you go out and you get some food, I'm going to mention Bollywood again. If you go out and you get Bollywood, they might charge you $3.50 for one taco, but they might give you the offer of having having 3 tacos for $7. So if you buy more, they may reduce the average price that you pay. Or if you are a student, they may give you a student discount, right? And so you pay a different price as a student than a normal consumer would. So different prices occur for different people quite frequently in markets. And so to me, this is something we need to spend a lot of time talking about, okay? So that's price discrimination, charging different consumers different prices. What we're going to start with today, in terms of the math, is thinking about perfect price discrimination. So there are different forms of price discrimination. This perfect price discrimination doesn't really happen much. I don't know if I can really think of an example where this truly happens, but it's the easiest to deal with mathematically, and it gives us kind of this baseline case to study. This is sort of the most extreme example of price discrimination you can have. So at one end of the spectrum, you've got no price discrimination, like we saw in the prior videos. On the complete other side of the equation, you've got perfect price discrimination. So that is as extreme as it could be. reality often lies somewhere in between. So it's nice to have these two extremes as sort of our comparison cases here. Okay, so perfect price discrimination, sometimes called first degree price discrimination. This is where consumers are charged their willingness to pay. This is where consumers are charged their full willingness to pay. So there's something you really like, a hat that you really like, and you think to yourself, I'd be willing to pay $22, no more. That'd be the maximum I'd be willing to pay. For this to occur, the business would have to figure out a way to charge you exactly $22. Okay? It's an extreme case. It's probably not really going to happen in the real world, but there are some examples where we can get pretty close to this. Okay? So that is perfect price discrimination, and let's think about what that would look like in our model over here. So here's our same starting point for the monopoly. They've got prices and quantities that they can choose, but now let's imagine they can perfectly price discriminate, okay? What that means is they don't have to just determine one price and stick to it. They can charge each consumer a different price, or they may even be able to charge each consumer different prices for each unit, okay? So let's say that this is tacos, all right, and I'm the only consumer of this good, just to make this nice and clean. All right, well, first of all, as before, if they sell none, there's no revenues to count. But if I go in and I'd say I'd like to buy one taco, the business would figure out a way to charge me exactly $6, okay? So the total revenue would be $6, and the marginal revenue would be $6, okay? Now here's where things change. In the case for a normal monopoly that can't price discriminate, if they want to sell the second unit, they would be forced to reduce the price, okay? But in the case of perfect price discrimination, they don't have to just stick to one price. They can charge many prices. So if I'm the only consumer, I go into the taco stand and I'd say, I'd like to buy one taco. They charge me $6. I eat it, yum, 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 okay? And then I say, I'd like to buy another one. And they say, okay, well, the second one is $5, okay? So I pay $6 for the first one and $5 for the second. And so the total revenue here would be $11. And the marginal revenue, the change in revenue that occurs, would be $5. All right? I eat both of those, but I'm still not full. I'd like a third one, but because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, of course, I'm not going to be willing to pay as much. This is typically how customers are, right? As they buy more and more of an item, they desire them less and less. So after I finish two, I go up to the counter and I say, you know what? I'm still hungry. I'd like to buy another taco. They would figure out that I'm willing to pay $4. They can't charge me $5 anymore, all right? And if they charge me $1, well, they're not maximizing their potential revenue. So if they are perfectly price discriminating, I would buy the first for $6, the second for $5, and the third for $4. So if they sell 3 items, they're able to earn $15 in revenues. All right, and I'm just going to complete this little table here. If that didn't make sense to you, probably go back, listen to it again, just to make sure that it clicks. But here would be our total revenues and our marginal revenues. So now let's think about graphing this scenario. What you should notice right away now is that when we graph this demand curve, right, this is that willingness to pay again. This is willingness to pay. When I graph that demand curve, you now will notice that the marginal revenue is the same as the demand curve. So the demand now equals the marginal revenue. Okay? So if we think about a marginal cost curve, this will now be very different. For this firm, they're still going to operate where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That golden rule of profit maximization is still true. But we have a different graph now. The marginal revenue curve is now equal to the demand curve. So now this would be our quantity. Okay? And a lot of students make this mistake, and I'm going to draw it here in hopes that you don't make this mistake. They also will go in and they will label that as the price. Can you think about why that would be problematic to label that the price? The thing is here, there isn't a price. There are many, many different prices. You can kind of think for a more reasonable scenario. Most monopolies aren't just charging, one customer, a few bucks for just a couple of tacos. Most monopolies are still producing hundreds or thousands of units. So there's going to be hundreds or thousands of different prices. There's not really a way to label those prices because there's more than one. So I'm not even going to worry about labeling the price. This would be our quantity, this would be our demand, this would be our marginal cost curve. Okay. So now let's think about what's going on with consumer surplus in this example. Okay. So in fact, let's go back and compare two graphs. So this is without price discrimination on the left, and this will be perfect price discrimination on the right. And I want to draw those same graphs that we had before, but I now want to start thinking about utility. I want to think about consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. I want to think about, is price discrimination more or less efficient? Is it more or less equitable? If you're a consumer, would you like perfect price discrimination? So let's compare the two. These are our two extremes. No price discrimination whatsoever, and perfect price discrimination. And let's make sure that we know how to draw this. If I were you, I would practice drawing these. That'll help you prepare for the quizzes and exams. So without price discrimination, as we just saw, demand and marginal revenue will be unequal. In fact, marginal revenue is twice as steep as demand. Marginal cost is that kind of Nike swoosh shape that we have where it goes down and then back up. We can find the quantity at marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And we can find the price where the willingness to pay is indicated by that quantity level. Okay? So that would be all our nuts and bolts. Let's now think about the different types of utilities that are gained here. So if you're a consumer, let's think about your consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is always the area between demand and the price. So that would be this area right up in here. That would be consumer surplus. Producer surplus is always the area between the price and the supply curve. If you recall from the last set of videos we had, this is actually the supply curve because there's only one firm. So this firm's cost represents how willing they are to sell. So the producer surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve, which is that area right in there. And then lastly, you're left with a deadweight loss of that quasi-triangle shaped shape that you have right there. That's the deadweight loss. Again, this is the potential surplus that the market doesn't get because of the way the monopoly profit maximizes. This monopoly charges more than a perfectly competitive firm would and produces less, which results in some items not being produced and consumed because it's not in the best interest of the monopoly to do so. So this is inefficient in that sense. So if you're a consumer, monopolies typically are not super desirable because they charge a high price and a low quantity. However, there still is a consumer surplus, so consumers are still getting value out of this market. Let's now compare that to a scenario with perfect price discrimination. With perfect price discrimination, the demand is equal to the marginal revenue curve. Okay? Marginal cost, still that Nike swoosh. You can kind of imagine that these two scenarios are the same, except this one's not price discrimination. This one is perfect price discrimination. Okay? In this scenario, this would be our quantity. And now let's think about the consumer and producer surplus. All right? And the graphs don't do a super good job of showing this, but let's conceptualize it here. All right? At that taco stand, when I walk in and I think to myself, the most I'd be willing to pay is $5, and they charge me $5, how much consumer surplus am I getting from that? The answer is none. All right? I'm not getting any consumer surplus from it because all of my potential surplus is completely eroded away by the price. They're going to charge me my full willingness to pay, so I don't really generate any utility from it. I only consume the tacos because it's just as good as my next best option, right? It's like I'm not really generating any economic profit from it as a consumer. Instead, all of what's good from the market goes to the producer. You can kind of imagine here that this is the willingness to sell shown by the marginal cost curve. And the consumers come into the store and they're willing to spend a certain amount of money, and the consumer is going to be charged the full amount. All right, there's going to be lots of different prices charged to these consumers here. And the difference between the price they pay and the marginal cost curve is going to be the producer surplus for each unit produced. If I'm the producer and I can make a taco for $1 and I charge a consumer $7, I generate $6 in producer surplus. And since I'm always charging the full willingness to pay, all of this area here will end up going to the producers. All of that area ends up being producer surplus because, again, the consumers are charged their full willingness to pay. The price they pay is going to be whatever they're willing to pay at the absolute maximum. So the area between the price and the supply curve is the producer surplus. It's just that we have many different prices now in this scenario. So this shape, I don't know what to call that, but that shape in there is our producer surplus. What about consumer surplus? Well, as we said before, there isn't any because consumers are always charged their full willingness to pay. What about deadweight loss? Well, it turns out there is no deadweight loss because every unit where the consumers are willing to pay more than the producers are willing to sell it for, all of those units are actually being produced and consumed. So it actually turns out that this is an efficient outcome. It's efficient because there's no deadweight loss. But I think you can make the argument that this is very inequitable. So even though from an economic standpoint it's efficient, it's not really desirable, is it? It's not desirable because the consumers are getting no value from this market. All of the value is being eroded by the producers. So two extreme cases that are not so common. Monopolies charging just one price to all consumers, and monopolies charging the same price, monopolies charging the full willingness to pay, different prices to all consumers. Two extremes. In the next video, we'll start thinking about some possibilities that are more nuanced, that really run between these two extremes.